The first crack appeared on a Tuesday morning, a hairline fracture in the basement's north wall that hadn't been there the day before. Sarah pressed her palm against the cold concrete, feeling the faint vibration that seemed to pulse from somewhere deep within the foundation. The house on Elderwood Street had stood for 97 years, weathering storms and seasons with the stoic resilience of old construction. But now it was trying to tell her something. 3 weeks after moving in, she and Marcus had discovered the crack during their weekend project of converting the basement into a home office. What started as a minor cosmetic concern became an obsession when Marcus noticed the wall sounded hollow. By Wednesday evening, they'd removed enough crumbling mortar to reveal a gap, and by Thursday night, they'd uncovered the edge of something that shouldn't exist. A sealed room, hidden behind 70 years of deliberate concealment. The previous owners had never mentioned it. The home inspection had missed it entirely. As Sarah aimed her flashlight through the widening hole, illuminating dust motes that danced in air untouched since the Truman administration, she saw the outline of furniture, the corner of what appeared to be a desk, and something else, something that made her breath catch in her throat. This wasn't just a forgotten storage space. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide this room, to bury whatever secrets it contained beneath layers of concrete and silence, and now those secrets were about to surface. Before we break through that wall and discover what's been waiting in the darkness, if you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss what happens next. Give this video a thumbs up if you love mysteries that blend history with suspense, and drop a comment below telling me what country and city you're watching from. I love seeing where our community spans across the globe. There's something magnetic about old houses, isn't there? They hold memories in their walls, stories in their floorboards, whispers in their attics. Every creaking stair and drafty window carries the echo of lives lived, of moments both ordinary and extraordinary. When Sarah and Marcus Chen purchased 1247 Elderwood Street, they knew they were buying more than property. They were acquiring a piece of history, a 1920s craftsman with original hardwood floors, leaded glass windows, and the kind of architectural character that modern construction rarely captures. The listing had described it as a vintage gem with original features, and during their first walkthrough, they'd fallen in love with the built-in bookcases, the clawfoot tub, and the way afternoon light filtered through the beveled glass of the front door. They imagined dinner parties in the formal dining room, lazy Sunday mornings in the sun-drenched breakfast nook, and quiet evenings reading by the living room fireplace. What they hadn't imagined was that their new home had been keeping a secret, sealed away in concrete and darkness, waiting for someone curious enough to find it. Marcus had always been the practical one, the engineer who approached problems with methodical precision. When he first noticed the crack, he'd measured it, photographed it from multiple angles, and researched foundation issues specific to houses built in the 1920s. Sarah, a historical researcher for the City Museum, approached mysteries with an investigative mindset that proved equally valuable. Together, they made a formidable team, and they were going to need every bit of their combined skills to unravel what they were about to discover. The house had been built in 1926 by a man named William Harrington, a detail Sarah had unearthed from county records during their due diligence. Beyond that basic fact, the property's history became murky. Ownership had changed hands 7 times over the decades, each transfer unremarkable except for one. In 1952, the house had been sold at auction after sitting vacant for 3 years. No explanation existed in the public record for why it had been abandoned, and the previous occupants, a family named Morrison, had seemingly vanished from local documentation. Sarah had made a mental note to investigate further, but between unpacking, settling into new jobs, and managing the 1,000 small crises that accompany any move, the historical puzzle had slipped down her priority list. Now, staring at that crack in the basement wall, all those unanswered questions roared back to relevance. The crack widened over the next 48 hours, not dramatically, but enough to concern them both. Marcus spent his lunch break calling structural engineers, describing the symptoms and trying to get someone to squeeze them into an already packed schedule. The earliest appointment available was 3 weeks out. That evening, as they stood in the basement examining the damage, Marcus tapped the wall with his knuckles. The sound that echoed back was unmistakably hollow. He moved his knuckles 6 inches to the left and tapped again. Solid. 6 inches to the right. Solid. But in this particular section, roughly 4 feet wide and 7 feet tall, the wall rang with emptiness. Sarah retrieved a stud finder from their tool collection, and they spent the next hour mapping the hollow space. What they discovered made no architectural sense. Behind the basement's north wall, there existed a void approximately 12 feet wide and 15 feet deep, a room-sized cavity that had no entrance, no windows, no apparent purpose. The basement's layout should have been simple, a rectangular space running the length of the house, with the furnace in one corner, the water heater in another, and open floor space in between. But according to their measurements, they were missing roughly 200 square feet. Someone had deliberately walled off a portion of the basement, then covered their work so seamlessly that 9 decades of subsequent owners had never noticed. Marcus grabbed a hammer. Sarah caught his wrist. They looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. Whatever was behind that wall had been hidden for a reason, and they were about to violate someone's long-kept secret. Marcus lowered the hammer. They needed to think this through, to consider the implications, to maybe consult with someone who understood historical preservation or property law. But even as Sarah voiced these reasonable concerns, they both knew they weren't going to wait. Curiosity had already won. They just needed to acknowledge the victory and get on with it. Marcus positioned his hammer against the weakest point of the crack and swung. The concrete crumbled more easily than expected, decades of moisture having compromised its integrity. Dust billowed into the air, and they both stepped back, coughing. Sarah pulled 2 dust masks from their renovation supplies, and they resumed their work with protective gear and renewed determination. Within 20 minutes, they'd created a hole large enough to shine a flashlight through. The beam cut through darkness that felt almost solid, illuminating a slice of the hidden room. Sarah saw immediately that this wasn't just empty space. Furniture stood arranged as if frozen in time. A wooden desk, a filing cabinet, a bookshelf lined with what appeared to be ledgers. A calendar hung on the far wall, too distant to read but clearly visible. This wasn't a storage room that had been accidentally sealed. This was a workspace, abandoned mid-use and deliberately entombed. They enlarged the hole until it was big enough to climb through, working with increasing urgency as sunset deepened into evening. Neither spoke much. The only sounds were the impact of hammer on concrete, the clatter of debris hitting the basement floor, and their own breathing, loud in the confined space. When the opening finally reached sufficient size, Marcus ducked through first, turning on his phone's flashlight to supplement the beam from Sarah's larger flashlight. She followed seconds later, and they stood together in a room that hadn't felt human presence since Dwight Eisenhower occupied the White House. The air was stale but not foul, sealed so completely that even decay had been arrested. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, but beneath that grey shroud, the room's contents waited in remarkable preservation. The desk was solid oak, pre-war construction of a quality rarely seen in modern furniture. Papers were scattered across its surface, edges curled with age, but still legible. The filing cabinet, when Sarah tried the top drawer, was locked. The bookshelf held not just ledgers, but also personal items. A framed photograph face down on one shelf, a woman's glove draped over a stack of files, a coffee cup with dried residue still coating the bottom. Sarah approached the calendar on the wall, her heart hammering. October 1952, the month displayed, featured a photographically enhanced image of autumn leaves. Someone had circled October 23rd in red ink and written a single word in the margin: final. Below that, in smaller letters, God forgive me. The handwriting was elegant, precise, the script of someone educated in an era when penmanship mattered. Sarah photographed the calendar with her phone, then turned her attention to the desk. The scattered papers appeared to be financial records, columns of numbers and dates stretching back to the late 1940s. Marcus had moved to the filing cabinet and was examining the lock, considering whether they had the tools to pick it or if they'd need to force it open. Sarah called him over to look at the papers. Even with her historical training, the context wasn't immediately clear. These appeared to be accounting ledgers, tracking payments and receipts, but the labels were vague. Package 7A, delivered. Shipment 14, received. Distribution Northwest, completed. Nothing illegal on its face, but nothing transparent either. The amounts were substantial, even accounting for 70 years of inflation. Whoever had worked in this room had been managing serious money. Marcus picked up the overturned photograph from the bookshelf and turned it over. The frame held a black-and-white portrait of a man in his 40s, handsome in that crisp, formal way of mid-century masculinity. He wore a suit with wide lapels, his hair pomaded and parted with razor precision. His expression was confident, almost challenging, the look of someone who'd mastered his corner of the world and knew it. Sarah took the frame from Marcus and studied the face. Something about the man seemed familiar, not because she'd seen him before, but because he embodied a type. The self-made success, the American dreamer, the man who'd fought in the war and come home determined to build something that mattered. She wondered if this was William Harrington, the original owner, or someone connected to the Morrison family who'd occupied the house in the early 1950s. Behind the photograph, tucked into the back of the frame, she found a folded piece of paper. She carefully extracted it, the aged paper crackling slightly as she unfolded it. The message was handwritten in the same elegant script as the calendar notation. To whoever finds this, I did what I thought was right. The world was different then. Judgment belongs to history now, not to me. W.M. The initials didn't match William Harrington. W.M. Morrison, perhaps? Sarah needed to cross-reference this against the property records to trace the exact timeline of ownership and occupation. They spent another hour documenting everything with their phones, taking hundreds of photographs from every angle before disturbing anything further. This was Sarah's training kicking in. Preserve the context before you investigate the details, because you can never recreate the original arrangement once it's been disrupted. Marcus found a leather briefcase tucked under the desk, so old it had become brittle. He carefully placed it on the desk surface and opened the corroded latches. Inside were more papers, but these were different. Personal correspondence, letters written in various hands, postcards from distant cities, and a small journal bound in cracked leather. Sarah reached for the journal with trembling hands. The first entry was dated January 3rd, 1950. The business is expanding faster than anticipated. Chicago wants triple the usual order. Detroit is asking questions I'm not comfortable answering. But the money is extraordinary, and we're building something that could set up our children for life. Margaret worries, but she doesn't understand how the world works. A man has to take opportunities when they present themselves. Sarah flipped through pages, scanning entries that spanned 2.5 years. The writing grew increasingly anxious, the confidence of early entries giving way to barely concealed fear. By August 1952, the tone had shifted entirely. They know. I don't know how, but they know. The federal people have been asking around town, talking to shopkeepers, questioning the rail workers. Someone talked. After all our precautions, all our careful arrangements, someone broke. Margaret wants us to run, to take the children and disappear. But where would we go? How do you disappear with 3 kids and a business? How do you abandon everything you've built? The final entry, dated October 22nd, 1952, one day before the calendar's circled date, was brief. It's finished. I've moved everything down here that could incriminate anyone else. Tomorrow, I'll seal it. Let them search the house. Let them tear it apart. They won't find this. In 20 years, maybe 50, someone will discover it, and by then none of it will matter. We'll all be dust, and the world will have moved on to newer sins. Tonight I told Margaret I love her. I told the kids they're the best thing I ever did. Because whatever else I am, whatever else I've done, that's true. Sarah looked up from the journal to find Marcus staring at her, his face pale in the flashlight beam. They were standing in the middle of someone's confession, the physical evidence of crimes or indiscretions deemed serious enough to warrant this elaborate concealment. The locked filing cabinet became their next priority. Marcus retrieved his toolbox from upstairs and returned with a small pry bar. The lock was old, weakened by decades of moisture exposure despite the room's general preservation. It gave way with minimal force, and the drawer slid open to reveal files meticulously organized and labeled. Sarah pulled the first folder. Distribution Records, Northern Route, 1950-1951. Inside were shipping manifests, delivery confirmations, and payment receipts. The shipments had gone to Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Milwaukee, major Midwest cities, all easily accessible from their location. But the manifests never specified what was being shipped. Quantities were listed as cases, with no description of contents. Payments were recorded as cash transactions, no bank records, no paper trail beyond these hidden files. Sarah's historical training was screaming at her. This pattern, this secrecy, the timing, early 1950s cash business, Midwest distribution network. She pulled another file. Suppliers, primary. The names meant nothing to her, but the addresses were scattered across 3 states. Another file, personnel, trusted. This one contained names, addresses, and brief biographical notes. Tommy Chen, war veteran, reliable, handles Chicago route. Wife doesn't ask questions. Richard Morrison, cousin, manages local operations, good with numbers. Morrison. There was that name again. The family who'd owned the house when it was abandoned. Marcus was methodically photographing each file, creating a digital record before they disturbed the originals further. Sarah moved to the bookshelf and carefully removed one of the ledgers. The entries were precise, almost compulsive in their detail. Every transaction was logged with date, amount, recipient, and a cryptic notation that might have been a location code or product identifier. She did rough math on several months of entries, and the numbers were staggering. Even accounting for inflation, whoever had run this operation had been moving the equivalent of millions of dollars annually. This wasn't some small-time scheme. This was organized, sophisticated, and clearly successful until it suddenly wasn't. Sarah found herself constructing narratives, historians' habit of building stories from fragments. A man, possibly William Morrison based on the initials, had built a lucrative distribution business in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The business was almost certainly illegal. Legitimate operations don't require this level of secrecy. The leading theory forming in her mind was bootlegging, except prohibition had ended in 1933. She'd need to research what other contraband had been profitable in the post-war era. Gambling operations? Black market goods in the rationing aftermath? Something else entirely? They worked until past midnight, documenting everything, carefully removing files and papers for closer examination upstairs where the light was better. Sarah's mind was already planning research strategies. Cross-reference the names in the personnel file against city directories and newspaper archives. Trace the Morrison family's movements after 1952. Search for federal investigations or indictments from that period that match this profile. Marcus was thinking practically about the physical space, whether they should reseal it, whether they were legally obligated to report this discovery, what it might do to their property value if word got out that their basement had been the nerve center of some mid-century criminal enterprise. They carried the most significant items upstairs and spread them across their dining room table. In the better light, details emerged that the basement's gloom had obscured. Many of the letters in the briefcase were written in code, simple substitution ciphers that Sarah recognized from her studies of historical correspondence. People in precarious positions often develop private languages to protect themselves. She'd need time to decode them, but even without full translation, certain words appeared frequently enough to hint at meaning: product, shipment, payment, protection, protection. That word appeared in multiple contexts, sometimes referring to payments, other times to arrangements or guarantees. Sarah pulled out her laptop and began preliminary research while Marcus made coffee. It was going to be a long night, possibly a long week, before they understood what they'd uncovered. She started with newspaper archives, searching for federal investigations in their region during the early 1950s. Several hits appeared, but one immediately captured her attention. Federal agents raid local businesses in multi-state investigation. The article, dated October 25, 1952, 2 days after the circled date on the calendar, described a coordinated operation targeting what the FBI termed interstate transportation of stolen goods. Several local businessmen were arrested, though the article didn't name them. A follow-up piece from November mentioned that some suspects had fled, evading arrest and leaving behind abandoned properties and unanswered questions. Sarah's pulse quickened. This had to be it. This was the event that had triggered the sealing of the basement room. Morrison, or whoever WM was, had seen the investigation closing in and had made a desperate gamble: hide the evidence, seal the room, and hope the authorities wouldn't discover it. Apparently the gamble had worked, at least partially. The house had been seized and sold at auction, but the hidden room had remained undiscovered, its secrets intact. Marcus read over her shoulder, following her logic. They were both silent for a moment, processing the implications. They owned a house that had been the headquarters of a criminal operation significant enough to attract federal attention. Hidden in their basement was evidence of crimes committed 70 years ago, preserved in remarkable detail. The people involved were almost certainly dead by now. The statute of limitations had long expired. This was history, not an active investigation. But it was history with weight, with the power to answer questions that had gone unanswered for decades, perhaps to provide closure to families who'd never known what happened to their relatives who'd disappeared in the autumn of 1952. Sarah felt the familiar pull of the researcher's calling, the drive to know, to understand, to excavate truth from the sediment of forgotten years. Marcus felt something else, a homeowner's protective instinct, a desire to shield their new life from complications and attention. They would need to find a balance, a way to honor both impulses. They talked until dawn, weighing options and obligations, eventually deciding on a course of action that felt right. They would document everything, conduct thorough research, and then contact the local historical society. If crimes had been committed, the criminals were beyond justice now. But the story deserved to be told, the puzzle deserved to be solved, and the people whose lives had intersected with this house deserved to have their stories preserved. Over the following weeks, Sarah devoted every spare hour to research, while Marcus continued the careful work of preserving and cataloguing the physical evidence. The personnel file proved invaluable, providing names that Sarah could trace through census records, city directories, and newspaper archives. Tommy Chen had died in 1967, his obituary making no mention of any criminal past, describing him instead as a decorated war veteran and devoted family man. Richard Morrison had left the state in late 1952 and resettled in California, where he'd lived quietly until his death in 1989. The Morrison family, Richard, his wife Margaret, and their 3 children, had indeed owned 1247 Elderwood Street from 1948 to 1952. After the federal raids, they'd vanished from local records, the house left empty and eventually seized for back taxes. Sarah found Margaret Morrison's death certificate from 1978, listing her residence as San Diego. One of the children, now in her 70s, still lived in California. Sarah debated reaching out, wondering if the daughter knew about her father's activities, whether she'd want to know, whether dredging up 70-year-old family secrets would bring clarity or pain. She decided to compile her findings first, to be certain of the facts before making contact that couldn't be unmade. The coded letters gradually yielded their secrets. Sarah had always enjoyed puzzles, and these ciphers were relatively simple once she'd identified the substitution pattern. What emerged was a portrait of a man caught between ambition and conscience. William Morrison had served in World War II, returning home in 1946 with big dreams and limited legitimate opportunities. The letters revealed that he'd initially tried conventional business ventures, but post-war competition was fierce and capital was scarce. Someone, never identified by name in the correspondence, had approached him with a proposition: use his military logistics experience to manage a distribution network for black market goods. The details were murky, but Sarah's research into post-war contraband suggested everything from rationed goods that remained controlled after the war, to stolen merchandise from warehouse thefts, to possibly even nascent narcotics distribution as drug enforcement was ramping up in the early Cold War period. Morrison had rationalized his involvement by focusing on the money, on providing for his family, on building something substantial in an uncertain world. His letters to his cousin Richard oscillated between excitement about their success and anxiety about the risks. By 1951, federal authorities were cracking down on interstate smuggling operations, part of a broader law enforcement push. Morrison knew the walls were closing in, but the money was too good to walk away from, until it wasn't. The Historical Society was fascinated when Sarah finally brought them her findings. They connected her with a professor at the State University who specialized in mid-century American crime, and together they began assembling a complete picture. The federal investigation in October 1952 had targeted a network spanning 7 states, with Morrison's operation being a significant regional node. Several people had been arrested and convicted, but Morrison and a handful of others had managed to evade capture. The FBI file on the case, now declassified, confirmed that Morrison had been wanted for questioning, but never located. Agents had searched the Elderwood Street house in late October 1952, finding nothing incriminating. They'd never suspected the sealed basement room, their search focusing on more obvious hiding places. Morrison had outfoxed them, at least temporarily, but in doing so had trapped himself. With federal warrants outstanding, he couldn't return to normal life. He'd taken his family and disappeared, leaving behind the house, the business, and the carefully hidden evidence that might have incriminated his associates. In a strange way, his final act had been protective. By sealing the records, he'd ensured that even if he was captured, the people who'd worked for him wouldn't be identified through his meticulous documentation. Sarah eventually made contact with Morrison's daughter, now 74, and living in a retirement community outside San Diego. The conversation was difficult, emotional, and ultimately enlightening. The daughter, Patricia, had been 9 years old when her family fled in the night, leaving behind everything familiar. She'd grown up knowing her father was running from something, but he'd never discussed the details, and she'd been too young to fully understand. He'd worked odd jobs under assumed names, keeping the family on the move for years before finally settling in California in the late 1950s. He died in 1961, taking his secrets with him. Patricia had spent her adult life wondering what exactly her father had done, whether he'd been a criminal or somehow wrongfully accused, whether the fear and displacement had been justified. Sarah's research provided answers, not all of them comfortable, but closure nonetheless. Morrison had been guilty of what he was accused of, but he'd also been a man of his time, shaped by war and economic anxiety, making choices he'd rationalized as necessary. Patricia thanked Sarah for solving a mystery that had haunted her for 65 years. She shared photographs of her father, stories about his later life, and details that helped Sarah complete the historical portrait. In their final conversation, Patricia mentioned that her father had often spoken about the house on Elderwood Street, always with regret, saying he wished he'd made different choices, wished he'd valued what he had instead of chasing what he wanted. The discovery made local news, then regional, and briefly national, as the story's human elements resonated beyond the historical curiosity. Sarah gave interviews, carefully framing the narrative to focus on the historical context rather than sensationalism. The house on Elderwood Street became a minor landmark, occasionally visited by history enthusiasts and true crime podcasters. Marcus good-naturedly tolerated the attention, though he insisted on certain boundaries: no tours, no trespassing, and absolutely no one entering their home without explicit permission. They restored the basement room, preserving it as a small museum space, visible through a plexiglass barrier, but otherwise untouched. The university's history department created an exhibition using photographs and selected documents from the Morrison files, with all proceeds going to fund criminal justice reform initiatives, a suggestion from Patricia, who wanted something positive to emerge from her father's mistakes. Sarah published an academic paper on the case, using it as a lens to examine post-war economic anxiety and the social factors that drove ordinary people toward criminal enterprises. The research opened new professional opportunities, and within a year she'd been offered a position at the university, teaching courses on American social history with an emphasis on primary source investigation. For Marcus and Sarah, the house on Elderwood Street became more than they'd imagined when they'd first walked through it on that spring afternoon 2 years earlier. It was home, certainly, but also a repository of stories, a reminder that every structure carries the accumulated weight of everyone who's passed through it. They finished converting the basement into that home office they'd originally planned, working around the preserved room, which they privately called Morrison's Confession. No. Late at night, when the house was quiet, Sarah sometimes went down there, standing at the plexiglass barrier and looking at the frozen tableau of desperation and hope. She thought about William Morrison, about the choices that seemed reasonable in the moment but proved catastrophic in retrospect, about the family torn apart by fear and flight, about the associates whose lives had been disrupted or destroyed. She thought about the fundamental human tendency to rationalize, to convince ourselves that circumstances justify actions we know to be wrong, to believe that we're special cases exempt from general rules. The hidden room was a monument to that very human failing, and also to the persistence of truth. Secrets have weight. They press against the walls that contain them. Eventually, given enough time, they find their way into the light. The story of 1247 Elderwood Street spread through the neighborhood, adding to the area's character and history. Elderly residents came forward with memories of the Morrison family, fragments that Sarah added to her research. One neighbor recalled Margaret Morrison as kind but increasingly anxious in those final months. Another remembered William as charming but secretive. These small testimonies, insignificant individually, accumulated into a richer portrait. The house itself seemed to settle once its secret was revealed, as if the foundation crack had been symptomatic of structural stress that eased once the hidden room was opened and its contents brought into the open. Whether this was imagination or reality, Marcus and Sarah both felt it. The house breathed easier now, no longer bearing the burden of concealment. They hosted Patricia for a visit, giving her the opportunity to see her childhood home and the room her father had sealed. She stood before the plexiglass for a long time, silent, tears running down her cheeks. Afterward, over dinner, she shared stories about the man she'd known, loving father, troubled soul, someone who'd made terrible choices but spent his remaining years trying to be better. She didn't excuse him, but she humanized him, and Sarah valued that complexity. History isn't served by simple villains or uncomplicated heroes. It's served by honest accounting of human beings in all their contradiction and nuance. So here we are, years after that first crack appeared in the basement wall, with the mystery solved and the story told. Sarah and Marcus still live in the house on Elderwood Street, still discover small surprises in its corners and crevices, though nothing as dramatic as a sealed room full of criminal evidence. They've painted and renovated, updated and modernized, but they've also preserved and honored. The house holds its history visibly now, rather than hiding it, and somehow that makes it more truly theirs. They've added their own chapter to its ongoing story, their own memories to its collection. The hidden room stands as a reminder that every house has secrets. Every structure contains stories, and sometimes, if you're curious enough and brave enough to look, you'll find that what's been buried is exactly what needs to be brought into the light. The past isn't really past. It lives in the spaces we inhabit, in the ground beneath our feet, in the walls that shelter us. William Morrison made choices that echoed through decades, affecting people he never met, shaping a future he couldn't imagine. His daughter found peace with his memory. His story became part of the historical record. And two people who'd simply wanted a charming old house found themselves caretakers of something more profound, a testament to human complexity, a reminder that judgment should be tempered with understanding, and proof that truth, given time, will find its way home.